Mortal Kombat, Mortal Kombat, Mortal Kombat, the brutal yet iconic franchise that has been captivating our imaginations for 30 plus years. Since its controversial debut in arcades, this series has always been shrouded in an intoxicating blend of mystery and intrigue. There were tantalizing glimpses of hidden characters lurking just beyond our reach, cryptic rumors whispered across playgrounds about secret fatalities, and Easter eggs waiting to be uncovered. But beneath many of the well-known urban legends, there exists a Mortal Kombat game so shrouded in mystery, so radically unlike anything the series had attempted before, that even some of the most dedicated fans can't agree whether it truly existed. There was no cancellation announcement, no farewell trailer, and not so much as a blog post to mark its disappearance. And yet, against all odds, it was real. Real enough to leave behind concept art, internal design documents, developer recollections, and just enough cryptic clues to fuel years of speculation. This project was never officially titled, but within the walls of Midway, this project was Mortal Kombat 8 in everything but name. A new chapter, a total reinvention. One so bleak, so narratively and visually twisted, it made the series' longtime anti-hero Noob Saibot look like a Blue Peter presenter. So with all of that said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. It's time to discuss the mysterious, lost Mortal Kombat 8. Yeah! Regular viewers of my channel will know that via my pinned comment that you can get huge discounts on Mortal Kombat 1, Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8 and thousands of other games. But what might really interest you today is that I have a discount code for you to get a ridiculous 41% off of the brand new Clair Obscur Expedition 33. An awesome looking turn-based RPG that in my opinion looks like one of the most interesting Western produced games in years. Every purchase supports my work, so happy shopping and hope you enjoyed this video. In 2006, Mortal Kombat Armageddon crash-landed onto store shelves in a flurry of spectacle and exhaustion. It was billed as the grand finale to the franchise's original continuity, a bloody, bombastic curtain call featuring every single fighter from the series' history, all crammed into a single title that was as chaotic as it was overstuffed. A celebration, yes, but also a clear signal that the formula was running out of road. What Armageddon promised in closure, it ultimately lacked in cohesion. Yes, it boasted a roster of unprecedented scale, every single character from the franchise's history, all thrown into one final blood-soaked celebration. But beneath the surface, the seams were beginning to show. Fighting styles were shared across characters, animations were recycled, and the much-hyped creative fatality system offered less of a climactic send-off and more of a clumsy, half-finished bar brawl. It was intended as the final act in a trilogy of reinvention that had begun with Deadly Alliance and Deception, an attempt to modernise the Mortal Kombat formula for a new generation. But instead of a triumphant conclusion, Armageddon felt more like the franchise collapsing under its own legacy. Yes, the ideas were still there, but the execution was starting to look tired, overly familiar, and outdated. What is even crazier though is that behind the scenes the situation was even more dire. Midway Games, the publisher that had shepherded Mortal Kombat from arcade dominance to home console staple, was in serious financial trouble. Years of mismanagement, mounting debt, and an increasingly competitive marketplace had brought the company to its knees. The kind of trouble that doesn't just sink projects, it sinks studios. This meant that within less than 3 years after Armageddon's release, Midway would file for bankruptcy, reporting over $280 million of debt. Yet, from the ruins of that crisis, emerged a rare creative opportunity. With the book effectively closed on the original Mortal Kombat timeline, series co-creator Ed Boon and his team recognised that this might be their only chance to start over, to wipe the slate clean, to walk away from decades of tangled lore, palette-swapped ninjas and supernatural excess, and to reimagine what Mortal Kombat could be if it shed its skin entirely. So what they began working on next was not so much a sequel, but more of a reinvention. A project so drastically different in tone, structure, and ambition that it barely resembled the franchise at all. The idea seemed to be to introduce a new tone, a new visual identity, and ultimately a completely different Mortal Kombat. And for a brief moment, it looked as though Mortal Kombat was on the verge of becoming something new, a reboot if you will. As what they were planning wasn't going to be another continuation of the existing timeline, picking up where Armageddon left off, but something more radical. The plan, it seemed, was to burn Mortal Kombat's legacy to the ground and build something far stranger, far more somber from the ashes. Essentially, everything that had come before was to be discarded and replaced with something darker, more grounded, and far more emotionally driven. The intention was to reboot the franchise with a tone deeply rooted in psychological horror. With Mortal Kombat 8, gone would be the exaggerated energy blasts and comic book magic. Gone would be the colour-coded ninjas with their Saturday morning theatrics. What remained would be a raw, stripped-back combat, set in a desaturated world filled with broken warriors, scorched temples, and haunted silence. It was Mortal Kombat, not as a fantasy spectacle, but as a bleak reflection on vengeance, suffering, and loss. At the centre of this creative transformation was concept artist Vincent Prost, whose vision helped define the haunting new direction the franchise was poised to take. In his own words, reflecting on his time at Midway, he recalled, "Before I left Midway, I created a pitch for a reboot of the game. I reworked the mechanics and characters, making them more modern and gritty." Years later, when his concept art was made public online, it sparked a wave of speculation and admiration from fans. These weren't simple redesigns or palette swaps, these were character deconstructions in a horror movie than a comic book brawler. Scorpion, for instance, was no longer the yellow-clad ninja Spectre fans had grown with. In Prost's design, he was reimagined as a hollow revenant, his robe soaked in blood of the demon who had clawed him out of the Netherrealm. It was not simply a visual change, it was a statement about the nature of his resurrection and his suffering. Sub-Zero 2 was transformed beyond recognition. Gone was the disciplined cryomancer with clean lines and honor-bound discipline. In his place stood a frostbitten wraith, undead and ethereal, his allegiance now tied to a mysterious new faction known as the Way of the Frost Dragon. It was a reimagining steeped in ancient myth and melancholic symbolism, and it set the tone for what the rest of the roster would become. Even the environments were planned to be dramatically overhauled. The vibrant fantasy settings of previous games, floating shrines, glowing pits, and energy-filled arenas were intended to be stripped away in favour of something far more unsettling. Replacing them would be war-torn cities, scorched temples, and desolate landscapes, all rendered with a grim realism that would have made the world feel lived in, wounded, and utterly believable. In tone, in texture, and in every miserable pixel, this was shaping up to be the most sobering interpretation of Mortal Kombat ever conceived, and that perhaps was the entire point. Even characters like Kano, long defined by his over-the-top aggression, were given additional layers. While still recognisable, brutal and thuggish, his updated reinterpretation suggested him having a mixed Japanese-American heritage, a subtle but meaningful detail that added nuance to his otherwise blunt persona. He remained irredeemable, still as fond of knives as ever, but now with a visual identity that told a more complex story. These were not just cosmetic changes, these are full reconstructions, each character torn down and rebuilt in the image of a darker, more emotionally grounded world. There was no room for neon colours, camp theatrics, or nostalgic nods to arcade cabinets past. The humour was gone, the winks to the audience would have been silenced. Even the series' infamous fatalities, once glorified in all their exaggerated gore, were becoming reconsidered as narrative devices rather than just party tricks. Mortal Kombat was shedding its skin, and what lay underneath was something far more severe. But just as this darker vision began to take shape, it was abruptly abandoned. There was no public cancellation, no press release, no dramatic send-off. It simply disappeared, quietly, without explanation, like a ghost of a timeline that had never truly been. In February 2009, Midway officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which would not result in Mortal Kombat receiving a change of tone, but instead something far more commercial. And with that, any notion of an ambitious, story-driven reboot was off the table. The mood inside the studio shifted from creative experimentation to emergency survival. Passion projects were now liabilities. There was simply no money left to take risks on the psychologically intense, horror-driven reimagining of Mortal Kombat, no matter how promising it may have been behind closed doors. Mortal Kombat 8, in the form it had been conceived, was too expensive, too artistically ambitious, and far too difficult to sell in a ballroom presentation. Its tone was grim, its gameplay speculative, its cast not as recognisable as normal. It was a visionary project, yes, but one that had arrived at precisely the wrong time. As series co-creator Ed Boon would later confirm in a characteristically blunt tweet, "We scrapped Mortal Kombat 8. And just like that, the team was told to pivot immediately. The reboot was dead. The The grim post-apocalyptic redesigns were shelved. Sub-Zero, once a frostbitten wraith or forgotten lore, was quietly folded away into the archives of abandoned timelines. In its place came a new direction, a new collaboration, a new project that could reuse existing assets, caught a broader audience, and, if all went well, buy the franchise one last chance at commercial survival. The game I'm of course talking about would not be the bleak character-driven reboot the developers had envisioned, but instead the ridiculous Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe. Yes, really. That's right, everything that had defined the reboot, the tortured concept art, the frostbitten revenants, the scorched temples, and the mythic rewrites, were swept aside in favour of a superhero crossover. Gone was the psychological weight, replaced by capes, logos, and comic book spectacle. In place of haunted battlegrounds and personal trauma, players were given Batman vs Raiden, Superman trading punches with Shang Tsung, and the Joker gleefully facing off against the champions of Earthrealm. The fatalities, long considered the lifeblood of Mortal Kombat's identity, were significantly scaled back. Blood was minimised, gore was softened, and in a move that raised more than a few eyebrows, DC's iconic heroes weren't even permitted to kill. The developers introduced heroic brutalities in their place, finishing moves designed to incapacitate and not eliminate. These concessions weren't arbitrary, they were the result of strict licensing conditions from DC Comics and a determined push to secure a teen ESRB rating, a decision driven more by commercial necessity than creative inspiration. This wasn't a bold new era for Mortal Kombat, it was a calculated compromise, a product shaped not by artistic freedom but by financial desperation and corporate alignment, a stopgap dressed as a sequel. And yet despite all of that, Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe wasn't entirely without merit. In fact, it quietly introduced one of the most important mechanical shifts in the series' history, a fully integrated cinematic story mode. This approach, presenting the narrative as a linear, character-driven experience rather than fragmented arcade ladders, would go on to define the future of the franchise under the NetherRealm Studios banner. Structurally and technically, it laid the groundwork for what was to come, but it wasn't the game that developers had wanted to make. It was the game they had to make. For true Mortal Kombat 8, the project that had begun as a dark, character-driven reimagining of the franchise was not abandoned because it had failed in development. It was sacrificed because it dared to be creatively ambitious at the exact moment Midway was collapsing under the weight of its own financial ruin. And yet, in spite of everything, the spirit of that cancelled project did not disappear entirely. When the series returned in 2011, now developed under the newly formed NetherRealm Studios and published by Warner Bros., it was immediately clear that something had changed. The tone was different, the colour palette was darker, the storytelling was more grounded, more character-focused, and laced with emotional consequence. Violence, while still visceral, carried narrative weight. There was purpose behind the pain. This shift was no coincidence. Many of the creative ambitions that had defined the cancelled reboot found their way into the 2011 relaunch. The somber tone, the redesigned character arcs, the emphasis on emotional trauma, these were all narrative echoes of Mortal Kombat 8's original vision. Even technical elements, animations, character models, and engine infrastructure first developed for Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe was quietly repurposed for use in the new game, stitched into its code like the phantom remnants of a lost timeline. And what's just as intriguing, the influence didn't end there. Both Mortal Kombat 10 and Mortal Kombat 11 would continue along the same trajectory, refining and expanding upon the foundations that had been laid years earlier. These games embraced the gritty cinematic storytelling model that had once seemed like an impossible gamble. Over time, the core DNA of the cancelled Mortal Kombat 8 didn't just survive, it evolved, and it came to define the modern era of the franchise. So what, in the end, was Mortal Kombat 8? It wasn't a product, it wasn't even a sequel, it was an idea. One born out of ambition, buried by circumstance, and later reborn in fragments across a new generation of games. A brutal, beautiful reinvention that never saw daylight, but cast a long, unmistakable shadow over everything that followed. Mortal Kombat 8 is the game that wasn't, and yet, somehow, still is. Don't forget, I can get you huge discounts on Mortal Kombat 1, Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8, and thousands of other titles, and even 41% off the brand new Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Every purchase supports my work, so happy shopping and cheerio!